Welcome back. Central to this whole debate is who can actually lay claim to any part of the Arctic Circle. It is not a sovereign territory, and so structures have been put in place to regulate the usage of this energy-rich area. The major statute is called the Law of the Seas, a UN creation which says a country can try to claim valuable drilling and mineral rights, but it depends on how close their continental shelf is to the North Pole. They can only claim resources within 250 kilometres of the edge of their own nation. There's another UN law set out in 1982 that says nations have 10 years after its ratification to prove any outstanding claim. 4 of the nations with claims, Russia, Canada, Denmark and Norway, have ratified the agreement. The US is yet to do so. For its part, the UN has said a panel will decide by 2020 who gets control of the Arctic. Let's bring in our guests again in Copenhagen, Flemming Gertrude Christensen, in Washington DC, Patrick Michaels, and in London, Barry Dalal Clayton. Gentlemen, thanks for staying with us. Let's go back to Copenhagen and speak to Flemming Gertrude Christensen. I made the point there about the UN panel. They reckon they can get this sorted out by the year 2020 with their panel. Do you think they can do that? Can they do it earlier perhaps? And the big question, will it be adhered to? Because let's face it, the UN, I'm not meaning to be rude here, but they do have a history of talking a lot and the action not actually coming through.
I think the viewpoint here from Copenhagen is that we have a lot of time pressure to acquire and document the necessary data towards the United Nations, and we are trying to get everything through before 2014, which is the deadline for Denmark, but it's very tough to get the data because you need icebreakers and it's a complicated situation.
But you feel people are committed to at least the idea of a UN law, and they will actually adhere to it?
I think we'll get the necessary data to put our claim forward to the United Nations, and hope that they will consider the claims that we are forwarding to the committee.
Patrick Michaels in Washington DC, you're there obviously in the United States, the country that has not signed up or ratified that particular law. What do you make of the UN's power, I guess I'd say, in this particular situation?
I'm reminded of another UN agreement, the Kyoto Protocol on global warming, which the United States did not ratify because the United States believed that it wouldn't do very much about climate change and it was going to cost a lot. Yes, the United Nations does have a history of putting forth agreements that in fact ultimately are not adhered to. The nations of the world certainly did not do Kyoto. I don't know why it is necessary to view this Arctic issue through the prism of the law of the sea. These countries can speak with each other. There's nothing preventing them from coming to an agreement, and I'm not so sure you need that right now.
But they've all got their own interests as well, and in the end a country's generally going to look after its own interests when competing with whether it be 4 other nations or 10 other nations.
Well, of course, but this is obviously not the first case in the world where countries that surround an ocean have exploited the resources in that ocean. Obviously it can be done and will be done. I don't think anybody's going to try and go to war over this or anything like that, and we're all mature nations that can speak to each other. John Negroponte, who is in Greenland, interestingly has said that he thinks the U.S. Congress may ratify the law of the sea in the future. I will remain to be convinced on that, but of course that would change the playing field some too.
Okay, let's go to London and speak to Barry Dalal Clayton again, because I'd actually like to pick up a point that you made in the first half about the Inuit people of the region. I believe they are gathering in Canada in November for their own summit to decide how to deal with these other countries. Should we be listening to their voice a whole lot more than we currently are?
Absolutely, we should. There are all kinds of interests and stakeholder groups. The Inuit, who meet through the Circumpolar Conference, are one very important group, but there are others. There are and the sovereign countries that surround the Arctic Sea themselves, the private sector interests, many groups that need to be brought into discussions here. The point here is that the law of the sea is but one instrument. We have many others as well, and there are many forums that can work to debate the future of the Arctic and how we manage it for a common future, including bodies like the Arctic Council. My take, as I would say before, is that we have some momentum, whatever its origins here, where countries are coming together. Let's use that as a platform. Let's move forward and look at these wider issues. And let's try to get consensus on how we do move forward. As was said before, we have time, not that much time, but we do have time to consider things. Let's do it in a way which progresses us to a sustainable future and not one that just exploits the resources for short-term gain.
Right, so let's pause for a moment and think about the groups we've got here. We've got the UN, we've got the Inuit people of the area, we've got the interested nations. Then we've got, say, a country like Russia, and I'm sure we've got the pictures here of the Russian flag being planted on the seabed. Now, what is to stop, let me put this question to Flemming Christensen in Copenhagen, what is to stop any nation doing similar action on this? I know this was only planting a flag on the ocean floor, but what's to stop any other nation unilaterally taking even more action while we wait for the UN to figure all this out?
I think what we are talking about from our perspective is to get the necessary data from all the countries so we can make the claim through the United Nations. And when we talk about the other matters, it's a question about diplomacy. But it's my understanding that there's a good technical relation between many of the scientists around the Arctic Ocean in order to get the necessary data.
Patrick Michaels in Washington, D.C. Again, I'll just go back to this flag thing. It's such a symbolic thing which happened. Was it taken seriously, do you think, when the Russians put their flag there and said, this is ours?
No, it wasn't. It was a cheap trick. And, you know, frankly, who knows what goes on behind diplomatic closed doors. I'm sure that there are all kinds of levers and forces that can be interplayed between these nations that will prevent somebody from doing anything particularly obnoxious or egregious.
But it does raise a question. I mean, you said before that, you know, these are all mature nations who can deal with each other. But as I said before, a country is going to look after its own interests in the end. There's nothing stopping these countries going ahead and doing what they want to, really.
Well, it all comes out to a balance between interest and this particular area and probably a lot of other international issues. This Arctic mineral and oil business is not alone in the world among issues that these nations are discussing. So I think that there's a lot of horse trading that will go on, and people will probably behave pretty reasonably.
We would hope so. Barry Dillale-Clayton in London, let me go back to you. We would need to start exploring, I guess, the options, and that's what you've been telling us throughout this program. Is there a way, in your opinion, what is the way to, I'll use the word exploit the oil that is there in the Arctic Circle and still make it sustainable, make it viable, keep the polar bears safe, all of those things?
Well, I think we know that the technologies exist. We know that some of the major oil companies know how to go about it, but there are competing interests. There are lots of different viewpoints. Really what we need to do is use the momentum that this meeting and this agreement has created to explore how we go forwards. I've said it before. We have goodwill in most countries to look at these issues, but we need to find the forums and the mechanisms to come together and sit around the table. We have forums like the Arctic Council, we have forums like the Inuit Circumpolar Conference. Let's use these to face reality and see how we do balance these competing needs for the future. That's a simple message. We've never solved anything by going alone. The future's always a negotiated process and consensus. So let's do that.
Well, do you believe the willingness is there? Because, you know, when oil gets involved, it can make, pardon the phrasing here, but it can make people go a little crazy sometimes.
Indeed it can. But it's up to all the different stakeholders to raise the issues, put their flags on the table and demand that our politicians hear good reason.
Or put their flags on the seabed, perhaps even. Patrick Michaels in Washington, D.C. Let's get a few final thoughts from you. You've said from the start here that we need to get the oil, and that's fair enough. Oil's at $125 a barrel these days at the moment. Do you agree, though, with what Barry Dillale-Clayton says, that we need to go about it the right way?
Well, I really like Barry because he is very straightforward about his not-so-hidden agenda here. I think that it is very clear that the oil is going to be taken out of there. I think we can leave the polar bear out of it. Somebody didn't mention here that the boreal forest, the North Woods, used to extend all the way to the Arctic Ocean in Eurasia for thousands of years after the end of the last ice age, which means it had to have been warmer up there then than it is now. And the polar bear survived, and the Inuit culture radiated. So let's not conflate climate change and the decline of the polar bear.
Okay, and we have run out of time. I'm afraid I think the only question we didn't get in is what Santa Claus thinks about it all. Gentlemen, thank you for joining us. And to our viewer, thank you for joining us on this edition of Inside Story. Goodbye for now.